Well, hello again, students. I remain Mr. Laskowski, your faithful teacher, and the host of this ongoing series, AP United States History, and you. Now, today we're going to take a look at a dispiriting episode within a truly heartbreaking chapter in American history. And hearing those words and knowing that truth, you might be tempted to just stop this video right now. But here's the thing. The clock still runs on history whether or not you're paying attention, and the countdown to the AP exam ticks and talks even when you're on TikTok. So maybe stop trying to develop the next big viral dance video and pick up your pencil, because it's time for Reconstruction. When we think of the word reconstruction, we tend to think about physical things, buildings, railroads, maybe even entire cities that had been built and then destroyed and then needed to be rebuilt again. And make no mistake about it, there was a lot that got physically destroyed in the war, including cities like Atlanta and Columbia and Richmond. And factories and houses were burned down, rail lines were pulled up, plantations were torched, entire economies were destroyed. But buildings can always be rebuilt, and train tracks can always be put down again. But just repairing the physical damage that was done does not mean that the entire society has been completely fixed during the Reconstruction process. There is a lot more involved in that. And it's not just that you rebuild, it's how you rebuild. Take a minute to consider what happens when a bone gets broken. The broken parts of the bone need to be put back into alignment or set so that the bone can heal correctly. I discovered this a while back when I fell off my bicycle and broke my elbow. The doctor who treated me, a person I will forever call Dr. Elbow, came in and said I needed surgery or else the bone would maljoin when it tried to heal up. Maljoin, I love that word. A maljoined bone would be weaker and it would be more likely to break again. And so when Dr. Elbow told me this, I immediately consented to the surgery. But my second thought was, wow, this is a great metaphor for the United States in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. It was important that we set the broken bones of the North and the South properly so that they didn't maljoin. And do you know what they call it when the parts of the bone don't come back together properly? They call it non-union. Really? Non-union? I came to see that there was a reason I broke my elbow, and it wasn't just because I fell off my bike. It was so that I could share this metaphor with you. It was totally worth it. So, to be sure, there was plenty of physical reconstruction that we would need to do in order to bring the South back into the Union. But perhaps the most pressing need was to rebuild the Southern economy, which was no small thing considering how much of the land had fallen out of cultivation, due in part to absent farmers fighting in the war, physical destruction by Union armies, or the loss of labor due to the emancipation of those enslaved people. And that, of course, brought up another issue. What would be the legal and social status? What would their status be for those 3.5 million people who, until recently, had been held in bondage? How could they be protected from vindictive Southerners who might try to harm them or re enslave them? Would they have citizenship rights? Would they be counted as five-fifths of a person now? And would they be able to vote? And what about those rebellious Southerners themselves? Hadn't hundreds of thousands of them committed treason or something close to it? Should we imprison all of them and take away all of their land or all of their voting rights? And what would states need to do in order to reclaim their seats in Congress? Should we just say no harm, no foul, or should we force them to leap over some high hurdles in order to get back? In short, there were a lot of questions to answer, and it seemed like everyone had their own idea about what the best course of action would be. So let me now introduce you to something I call the harshometer, a scale for how lenient or how harsh Reconstruction should be. We can chart the positions of white Southerners, Republicans who came to be called radicals, and then the two presidents who would be put in charge of Reconstruction, if and when the United States ever won the Civil War, that was. Predictably, white Southerners felt that if they had to have any Reconstruction at all, it should be as lenient as possible. Essentially, they thought, if we can't win, then why can't you just forgive and forget? Just as predictably, many Republicans wanted as harsh a version of Reconstruction as possible. After all, Southerners had committed treason, they had waged war, and they had caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, all in order to preserve the cruel practice of enslaving other human beings. As Thaddeus Stevens put it when they seceded, the Southern states had committed suicide. And so, at the end of the war, they should be treated like conquered provinces. In other words, slide that harshometer scale all the way to the right and make the South pay. Now, you might think that Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican and he opposed slavery, that he also might want a harsh version of Reconstruction. But you'd be wrong. His version of Reconstruction would be remarkably lenient, with an emphasis on restoring the Union, protecting newly freed people, and moving forward together as a nation. President Johnson's version was similarly lenient, and some would think even more lenient than that of Lincoln. But I'm going to try to convince you that it's just barely more harsh than Lincoln's version of Reconstruction, at least in terms of how he wanted to treat former Confederate officers. Either way, those presidents are pretty lenient when it comes to their Reconstruction models. Abraham Lincoln's plan was announced in 1863, which seems really early. I mean, this was the year of Gettysburg and of Vicksburg, and it wasn't entirely certain that the Union was going to prevail at all in the Civil War. But it does show a lot of foresight for Lincoln to plan for the peace, even when there were still armies there in the field. So, what was Lincoln's plan exactly? Well, officially, it came to be known as the 10% Plan, and it required Southern states to do the following in order to be welcomed back into the Union. Step one, have 10% of the male population in a given state swear a loyalty oath. Step two, each state must accept the freedom of formerly enslaved people. And thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery was now over, and those Southern states had to recognize that. And step three, actually, there is no step three. That was it. And there was no need, he thought, for any military occupation of the South because Lincoln wanted Reconstruction to be as fast and as easy for the Southern states to come back into the Union. See what I mean about being lenient? Now, Lincoln's plan was sometimes called the Rosewater Plan, and here's why. Roses, as you know, are super fragrant, and it's possible to gather the rose oil that both imparts fragrance and has other therapeutic uses. However, pure rose oil is incredibly potent, and so just a drop or two can be overpowering, kind of like when certain ninth graders douse themselves in Axe body spray. But if you take a couple drops of the rose oil and diffuse it in water, well, then you've got a delightful perfume at a relatively low price. So, how could this be a metaphor for Reconstruction? Well, all you needed was a few drops of the oil, like 10% of the people taking a loyalty oath, and then the effect could be diffused throughout the other 90% of the population. Well, Lincoln's version of Reconstruction might have smelled nice, but radicals in Congress thought it was far too lenient. They wanted to make sure that Southern states felt a little bit of pain, lest they try something like secession again. And that is why they proposed the Wade Davis bill. And if you're a baseball fan, you might think, hey, wait, isn't Wade Davis the name of a journeyman pitcher who played for the Tampa Bay Rays and eventually helped the Kansas City Royals win the World Series? Yes, that is true. But it is also the name of the Republicans' Reconstruction Plan introduced in 1864. And here is what it said. Southern states would have to accept the end of slavery, just as in Lincoln's plan. And Confederate officers would be banned from ever voting again. But here is the kicker. States could only be readmitted into the Union if 50% of the white male population swore an ironclad oath, a ironclad loyalty oath. Now, first, consider that 50% is a whole lot more than 10%. I did the math. Second, consider that while Lincoln had not specified the race of the people swearing the oath, Wade Davis required that the people swearing their loyalty oath be white, which would be even harder to do considering the population of the Confederates in the South. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of this plan was that it was not just an oath, but an ironclad oath that these people had to proclaim. And that meant that people had to swear not only that they were loyal to the United States, but, and here's what makes it ironclad, but they always had been loyal to the United States, which is to say, they had never supported the Confederacy. Now, how difficult do you imagine it might be to find 50% of the white male population in a place like Alabama to swear that they'd never supported the Confederacy? If you answered that would be impossible, well, you'd be probably right, or at least close to it. And so the Wade Davis bill sort of assumed that the United States military would need to occupy southern states for years, maybe decades, until they were reintroduced into the Union. Well, when the Wade Davis bill was passed, it put Lincoln in a bit of a difficult position. He knew that the bill was too harsh and it would not help the nation to recover. It would not help the bones to set properly and heal. It was a recipe for non union. But Lincoln worried that in an election year like 1864, with the war not over yet and hundreds of thousands of dead Americans on his hands, that vetoing the bill might make Lincoln seem too weak on the South. And that might make folks turn away from him on election day. And so Abraham Lincoln got creative. He pocket vetoed the Wade Davis bill. And if you know your Constitution, and Lincoln did, you know that a president can sign a bill, it can veto a bill, or do nothing with it. And if the president does nothing, after 10 days, excluding Sundays, that unsigned, unvetoed bill is returned to Congress. If Congress happens to still be in session when the bill is returned, then the bill has been automatically passed even without the president's signature. But if Congress has adjourned, the bill dies. And we say that this bill has been pocket vetoed. And presidents pocket veto bills when they want the bill to die, but they worry about the political effects of killing it with a formal veto. Just letting it die serves the same effect, but without paying the political price. And so by pocket vetoing the Wade Davis bill, Lincoln was able to keep control of Reconstruction, his lenient version that would help prevent the South from maljoining. But first, we had an election to win. And it's hard for us to even imagine that Abraham Lincoln could have possibly lost his reelection bid in 1864. And yet, you have to remember that at that time, Lincoln had stumbled his way through several generals and hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers, and he still had not achieved the main war objective of capturing Richmond. And maybe that's why Lincoln spent much of the summer of 1864 in a deep funk. He was absolutely certain that he was going to lose the election. And worse yet, he thought that he was going to lose the election to the man he had fired after the Battle of Antietam, Gentleman George McClellan. Now, given what we know about how badly McClellan had bungled his war effort, it might seem strange that the Democrats had chosen him as their candidate. But he did have great name recognition, and he was technically a war hero. And that again, he also stood in opposition to Abraham Lincoln and basically anything he stood for, including the radical embrace of freedom for enslaved people and basic human rights for newly emancipated people. And so it kind of made sense that the Democrats would nominate McClellan. And heading into the election season of 1864, Frankly, things didn't look very good for Abraham Lincoln. But then along came my favorite Confederate general, John Bell Hood, who abandoned Atlanta to attack Nashville. And it was an act which allowed William Tecumseh Sherman to sweep into Atlanta, burn it to the ground, and give Lincoln a huge military victory, the kind of victory he needed to carry himself to victory in the election. Voters turned back toward Lincoln, and he was able to win the election of 1864. Thank you, John Bell Hood. And in the end, it wasn't even close. Yeah, a couple of states went for McClellan, but by and large, the nation rallied around President Lincoln, and he won in a landslide, as he should have. And the fact that Lincoln got reelected meant that he got to take the oath of office again and deliver another inaugural address. Now, maybe you figured this out by now, but Abraham Lincoln rarely missed an opportunity to speak profound truths and change the world with his words. The second inaugural address would be no exception. Indeed, if you ever go to the Lincoln Memorial, climb up their stairs, say hi to the big seated statue of Lincoln, then take a look at the inscription along the wall. On one side, it contains the words of the Gettysburg Address, which you could probably understand. Those words transformed the purpose of the war. But then look on the other side, in which the words to another speech are inscribed, the second inaugural address. That seems odd because no one remembers much about the first inaugural address, but the second one gets carved into a memorial? Yeah, actually it does. Read a bit of it and maybe you can see why. Now, the second inaugural address begins by reminding people that 4 years earlier, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. Both parties deprecated war, but listen to this sick burn. One of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let the nation perish. Dang. Then Lincoln went on to explain that he didn't know how long this war was going to go on because the war itself had become the price that Americans had to pay for the sin of slavery. And so he says, "Yet, if God wills that this war continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another with the sword, then the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." And then came the big finish, in which Lincoln encouraged his countrymen to keep going. And here you get a sense of Lincoln's tone when he says, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." Bind up the nation's wounds, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. See, did you catch that? Bind up the nation's wounds. Let's set our broken bones correctly so that they can heal, so that our nation can heal. The amazing thing about the second inaugural address is that these amazing world changing words almost never got uttered. And here you see Lincoln at the dais delivering the address. But in order to get to that position, he had to walk down the steps of the United States Capitol through a crowd that included John Wilkes Booth. In his diary later that day, Booth wrote, "What an excellent chance I had, if I wished, to kill the president." Well, luckily, he thought better of it that day. But a month later, after Lee had surrendered, after it became clear that the war was over and the Confederacy was dead, John Wilkes Booth's disappointment turned into desperation. After the capture of Richmond, you might remember that Lincoln visited the city, went to the Confederate White House, sat in Jefferson Davis's chair, and had what I like to call a moment of repose, an instant of calm in which Lincoln could reflect upon the 4 years of war and having finally accomplished his objective. He then came back from Richmond and accepted an invitation to attend a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. Meanwhile, John Wilkes Booth orchestrated a plot in which he and his fellow conspirators would attack the top figures in the United States government, all on the same night, essentially decapitating the leadership of the United States. And in the chaos, he thought, the Confederacy might yet spring back to life. It was a desperate plan, but the situation called for desperate measures. Now, I'm not going to dwell upon the details of that night, other than to say that the person charged with killing Vice President Johnson decided not to go through with it, and the person charged with killing Secretary of State William Henry Seward managed to attack Seward, but failed to actually kill him. Only Booth succeeded, slipping into the theater and then into the president's box and firing one shot at Lincoln's head at point blank range. If Abraham Lincoln had indeed been the savior of his nation, then it was perhaps fitting that, like Jesus, he was martyred on Good Friday. Now, after Lincoln was killed, doctors inserted a probe into the president's skull and fished out the bullet that had killed him. And that bullet and bits of Lincoln's skull, creepily, were collected and put in the National Museum of Health and Medicine. And several years ago, inspired by my very favorite book, Assassination Vacation by Sarah Vowell, I went to that museum to see the bullet for myself. And then, on another trip, I went to Baltimore to find the grave of John Wilkes Booth. And it's a weird little stone covered with pennies, as if to say, you might have killed the president, but Lincoln will always be on top. Now, one of the reasons why visiting the Museum of Health and Medicine and seeing the bullet that killed President Lincoln is so meaningful is that it serves as a reminder of just how much can change because of something so small. This tiny little piece of metal loaded into a gun by John Wilkes Booth in April 1865 and then fired into the back of the skull of Abraham Lincoln altered the course of history, and it totally transformed the experience of Reconstruction for Northerners and Southerners alike. Now, you might remember that before President Lincoln chose to attend the theater on April 14th, 1865, he was in charge of Reconstruction, and his lenient Rosewater Plan was the one that would define the process by which Southern states would be rehabilitated and brought back into the Union. Congress contributed to this process by passing the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. Now, you might think, hadn't Lincoln already done that with his Emancipation Proclamation? But remember, that only applied to states that had seceded, not the whole country. And because the Emancipation had been a presidential war directive, it could easily be superseded by an act of Congress or struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So the only way to truly guarantee the constitutionality of emancipation was to make it part of the Constitution. But Congress also recognized that simply freeing enslaved people did nothing to protect them or help them to navigate the treacherous waters of American society, which is why it created the Freedmen's Bureau. Officially, it was called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, and it strove to help millions of formerly enslaved people, and poor white people too, by providing them with food and housing and medical aid and education and job training. It aimed to settle newly freed people on Southern land that had been abandoned or confiscated during the war. But you will remember that Congress also wanted a much tougher version of Reconstruction, and it passed the Wade-Davis bill. Lincoln decided that forcing 25% of Southerners to sign the ironclad loyalty oath was just too severe, and it would not help him to bind up the nation's wounds with, in his words, quote, charity for all and malice toward none. So he pocket vetoed it, and Congress did not have the votes to override that veto. And that is why President Lincoln's version of Reconstruction was the one that was still in effect when the president went to Ford's Theater that night. But then that little piece of metal changed everything. In the space of one night, Reconstruction went from a difficult but manageable plan orchestrated by Abraham Lincoln, a president who was a Republican, who got credit for freeing the enslaved people, who won the Civil War, and who was reelected in a landslide. And it turned it over to his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southerner, a Democrat, an uneducated backwoods politician with a drinking problem. And maybe worst of all, he was also a white supremacist. And so, if Republicans had had any hope that Johnson would prove himself to be a worthy successor to Abraham Lincoln, they needn't have looked any further than Inauguration Day, when Andrew Johnson had embarrassed himself by drunkenly staggering through his own oath of office. Further conversations with President Johnson proved equally dispiriting and concerning, and soon radical Republicans and even moderate Republicans came to see that Johnson wasn't a partner in their plans, but an impediment to them. And so they began looking for ways to take control of Reconstruction and take it away from Johnson. And here I think it's important to remind folks precisely of who Andrew Johnson was and what he believed. And so we must start here in what we think was this building that you can find in downtown Raleigh. Born into poverty as the son of tavern servants, Johnson would be apprenticed to a tailor, but eventually run away and settle in the hills of eastern Tennessee, where he did establish a successful business as a tailor. And it's tempting to assume that Johnson was illiterate and ignorant just because he had been born into poverty and never had any formal schooling. But in fact, he did learn to read and write, at least by the time he got married at the age of 18, and he was an eager and curious learner. However, the narrative of the backwards ignoramus has clung to Johnson, probably because of all the other bad stuff that he did in his life. And eventually, Andrew Johnson migrated into politics, first serving as mayor and then getting elected to the state legislature, then to the United States House of Representatives, and eventually he was named to the United States Senate in 1856, all as a member of the Democratic Party. Not bad for a poor, uneducated tailor from Raleigh, North Carolina. However, when Tennessee seceded from the Union with other states, Andrew Johnson refused to go along with the rest of his state because, like a lot of people in eastern Tennessee, like the people in western Virginia, where slavery wasn't popular, Johnson believed that wealthy enslavers in the capital, in this case Nashville, were going to drive the state and the South to ruination with this talk of secession. And he wasn't wrong. And so he rejected secession and Confederacy, becoming the only sitting Southern senator not to resign his seat when the state seceded. And that is how he got noticed by Abraham Lincoln, who appointed him governor of the reconquered territories within Tennessee. And then in 1864, Lincoln, seeking to demonstrate that he would be a president for all the people, North and South, Republican and Democrat, looked around for a Southern Democrat to be his running mate. And that's how the newly renamed National Union Party, led by Lincoln and really the only option available, Andrew Johnson, swept to victory in the election of 1864. And then that little tiny piece of metal changed everything. After Lincoln was killed, the new President Johnson could have just adopted the Rosewater Plan and called it a day, but Johnson had other ideas. To him, the Southern states had never actually left the Union. They just thought they had left the Union, and so there wasn't any need to reconstruct anything, which pretty much explains his plan for Reconstruction. First, states had to ratify the 13th Amendment. Everyone agreed that slavery was finished, and so long as the Southern states agreed to this, he was prepared to give Southerners a general amnesty so that no military occupation would be necessary. But think about what this general amnesty is really all about. Johnson said instead of worrying about forcing some random percentage of the population to take a loyalty oath, he would essentially forgive his Southern brothers for their transgressions. especially the poor ones, the soldiers who had just fought because the rich Southern politicians had forced them into the fight. And that is where this delicious and vindictive exception to the general amnesty camp comes in. If you happen to be a former Confederate officer or a member of the Confederate government or just a rich Southerner with a lot of property, Andrew Johnson would not just forgive and forget. A person like you in this circumstance did not get your voting rights or citizenship rights back unless you subjected yourself to a particularly humiliating situation. And this is how it worked. Rich Southerners who wanted their rights back had to make an appointment to come to the White House, then sit there in the hall and wait until their name was called, and then enter the room where President Johnson was standing, and then they had to get down on their knees, humbling themselves before President Johnson and begging for forgiveness. What a deliciously petty thing for Andrew Johnson to demand, and one that no self respecting Southern gentleman would ever subject himself to. Would Jefferson Davis kneel before President Johnson? Of course not. Would Robert E. Lee humble himself? No way. Lee essentially said, I'll just move to Lexington, Virginia, and become the president of a college, one that would eventually become named Washington and Lee. But because of this vindictiveness, I've always thought that Andrew Johnson's plan for Reconstruction was just a little bit more harsh than Lincoln's. But I wouldn't argue with you if you thought that his general amnesty made Johnson's plan the more lenient one. Regardless, it was far too soft and far too easy a Reconstruction plan for most Republicans in Congress. And they opposed it, and they opposed him almost from the outset. You know who did like Johnson's plan? Most Southerners, who realized that they couldn't hope to rejoin the Union without recognizing that slavery was finished. And so they started the process of ratifying the 13th Amendment. And then they went about electing some of the old politicians back into the offices that they had left back in 1860 and 1861. And they rationalized now that these formerly enslaved people were not three-fifths of a person, but actually five-fifths of a person thanks to emancipation, that meant actually Southern states now had bigger populations and therefore could claim more seats in Congress. And besides, just because they accepted that slavery was no longer legal, there was a big difference between slavery and equality, or the end of slavery and achieving true social and legal equality. And so leaders in Southern states, eager to maintain the racial hierarchy that Alexander Stephens had said was the cornerstone of that Confederacy, they figured out ways, both legal and extra legal, to maintain a society and a government run by white supremacists. The legal ways would be the black codes, and the extra legal ways would be vigilante groups such as the Knights of the White Camellia and the Ku Klux Klan. So let's look at each of these in greater detail. As soon as the war ended, Southern states moved to curtail the rights and liberties of newly freed people. These took the form of black codes, which can be defined as a series of state laws and local regulations designed to keep the newly freed population in a state of semi slavery. Now, you might think that slavery is an all or nothing proposition. How can a person be in a state of semi slavery? It's a great question. So let me share this one example and see if you can understand what I'm talking about. A state could pass a black code, which, as the name suggests, only applied to one race of people. And that law might be something like a vagrancy law, something that forbids unemployed people, or what they called vagrants, from being in public spaces like roads and parks and sidewalks. That seems like a reasonable way to protect the population, right? But consider this scenario. Imagine that you are a formerly enslaved person who has just earned freedom. That means that you are now free to leave the plantation and head the, I don't know, 2 miles into town to get a job at a local factory that you know is hiring. And so you take two steps off of the plantation as a free person. Now you, however, are in a public space, and wouldn't you know it, a police officer appears there and says, "It is illegal for unemployed vagrants to be in the street. Do you have a job?" And of course, your reply to this might be, "Look, I just left this plantation 2 steps ago. I'm heading into town to start a new job. I have a brother who has a place for me and a place to stay in town. So, no, I'm not a vagrant." But the police officer would say, "Yeah, but do you have a contract proving that you have a job at this precise moment?" And you reply, "I will as soon as you let me get to that factory building 2 miles down the road." And the police officer responds, "But you don't have one right now?" And you say, "Well, give me 30 minutes and I'll have one." But the police officer says, "Technically, you don't have one, which means you're unemployed as of this minute, right?" And I guess technically you are. And so the police officer says, "Well, that makes you a vagrant." And guess what the punishment for vagrancy is? It's either being put in jail or it's being returned to your previous place of employment, which is where again? That's right, the plantation that you just left. So, is this newly freed person enslaved anymore? No, not officially. But is this newly freed person kind of forced to stay on the plantation, working for a white landowner who can decide exactly how much to pay his employees? Yeah. So, it's not slavery, you see, at least not in name, but it is semi slavery, isn't it? And it is this fact that the officially free people often found themselves trapped in an exploitative labor system, doing the same work that they had been doing before the war, prevented from leaving or escaping, and subject to the same whims and prejudices of white landowners as they had been during slavery. So, semi slavery. But if you happen to somehow make your way to that city, move in with your brother, and actually get a job at that factory, now, as a free person, you might want to start enjoying your freedom and independence. And you might even start trying to claim your citizenship rights. And that's when extra legal organizations like the KKK would step in, using terrorism to try to keep newly freed people from speaking up for themselves or standing up for themselves. And let's call it what it was, terrorism, which you will remember we have defined as using violence against non-combatants for political purpose. And so if the black codes didn't keep people confined and subservient, groups like the KKK would use violence and intimidation to maintain that white supremacist hierarchy. And so there is meaning in why the KKK members dressed up in those white sheets. Sure, it was to maintain the illusion of anonymity, but actually it was because they were dressing up like ghosts, specifically the ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers, using violence to achieve in the post war society what the soldiers had failed to do on the battlefield. But by December of 1865, enough states had ratified the 13th Amendment that it got officially added to the Constitution. And this ratification had two important effects. The first was that it convinced old William Lloyd Garrison that he no longer needed to publish his abolitionist magazine, a newspaper, The Liberator. He had been writing it since 1831, agitating for immediate, uncompensated emancipation of all enslaved people, and it took 34 years, so it wasn't exactly immediate. But as for the uncompensated emancipation of every enslaved person, mission finally accomplished. And the second thing that happened with ratification was that President Johnson declared that Reconstruction was over. Look at that. Really? Just like that? That was quick. Okay, 4 years of war, destruction, 3/4 of a million dead people, abandoned plantations, cities burned to the ground, thousands of miles of railroad lines torn up. How long should that take to repair 4 years of damage? 8 months? That sounds about right. Wait, no, it doesn't sound right. Now, if you've ever spent any time at the beach, you probably know that it takes a lot longer to build a sandcastle than to destroy a sandcastle. You might spend hours and hours shaping the structure into something beautiful, and substantial, but it can be destroyed in an instant by a wave or just some person coming along to knock it down. And so, if it took 4 years to destroy the Confederacy, by rights, it should take a lot longer than that to rebuild it. But not to Andrew Johnson, who was happy to declare that Reconstruction was over and then let Southern states pretty much do what they wanted after that. Of course, this did not sit well with members of Congress, who then declared that Johnson was wrong and that Reconstruction was actually not over until we say it's over. And so, when Southern states elected representatives to Congress at the end of 1865, because, Reconstruction was over, Republicans were having none of it. They refused to let the Southern representatives take their seats, and then, while they still had these big majorities in Congress, they worked to pass as many civil rights laws as they possibly could. And so the results were predictable, but also significant. The more that Andrew Johnson pushed back against the radical Republicans, the more he alienated the moderate Republicans who had previously supported him. And this meant that Andrew Johnson then had to find friends among the very white Southerners, those people who he'd opposed previously. And this only served to push those moderates further and further away from Johnson. And it ended up taking a three-way tug of war and essentially turning it into a two-way tug of war, and it looked something like this. So now that we've got a two-sided fight between white Southerners and Republicans, both moderate and radical, we can now see that the battle lines are drawn for a true conflict over the future of Reconstruction. With moderate and radical Republicans aligned, they could pretty much do anything that they wanted. And so they realized that just what a huge effort it was going to be to care for 3.5 million formerly enslaved people. And so they passed a dramatic expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau. But Johnson vetoed it because now that Reconstruction was over, the government didn't need to do anything more for newly freed people, at least not in his mind. And then Congress overrode President Johnson's veto because they thought Reconstruction was not over, and so more needed to be done. And so, if you haven't taken government class, I should probably mention that a veto can be overridden by Congress if two-thirds of the members of both houses of Congress vote again in favor of the bill, even after a presidential veto. And that's what happened here. And more included, and more than that, Congress also passed a new Civil Rights Act. And this was a law that formally recognized the citizenship rights of the newly freed people, and it guaranteed them the same protections that white citizens have. I wonder what Andrew Johnson is going to do about that. Oh, right, he's going to veto it because, in addition to believing that Reconstruction was over, he certainly didn't believe in racial equality or citizenship rights for formerly enslaved people. But what would Congress do? Of course, it would override that veto also. You see, having overwhelming numbers of Republicans in Congress meant that they could pretty much pass any law, regardless of Johnson's opinion about it. And this frustrated Johnson to no end, which really made Republicans happy. But what could Johnson do to change the equation here? Well, what Johnson could do was try to diminish the Republican majority in Congress by actively campaigning on behalf of Democrats in the midterm election of 1866. And the logic was this: if he could get people to support him, then they'd vote for Democrats in that election. And doing that would weaken Republicans so that the Republicans would not be able to override his vetoes anymore. But of course, doing that, meaning going out on the campaign trail, that would require Johnson to, go out on the campaign trail and actively insert himself into the congressional campaigns of Democrats around the country. And it was essentially what we today would call a campaign swing. but was what was described back in the day by the press as a swing around the circle. The swing around the circle. Now, today, we actually expect our presidents to go out on the campaign trail like this and to speak out in support of their political allies. But in 1866, it was not common at all. In fact, people thought it was totally inappropriate for the branches of government to be interfering with each other like this. So I wonder how the swing around the circle went. In a word, poorly. In two words, extremely poorly. Johnson tried to talk to some of the crowds, but then hecklers started yelling things like, "Hang Jeff Davis!" To which Johnson, enraged, shouted back, "Why not hang Thaddeus Stevens?" who was one of those radical Republicans. That did not go over well, and then he got heckled time and time and time again, and each time he responded by shouting at the audience. And then some of his friends encouraged him to maybe maintain his temper and his dignity, to which he loudly responded, "I don't care about my dignity." That also did not go over well. And pretty soon, people began wondering whether President Johnson, who had been publicly drunk at his inauguration, might be giving these speeches while under the influence. And by the end of the tour, Johnson was described in increasingly hostile press accounts as, and I quote here, vulgar, drunken demagogue who was disgracing the presidency with his loud and violent rallies. Indeed, Andrew Johnson probably would have been much better off if he had just stayed home and just stayed quiet. Because when election day came, the Republicans won even more seats in Congress, and they were able to take absolute control over Reconstruction. And that's what led to the much more harsh version of Reconstruction that we will call Congressional Reconstruction. And the results of the election also convinced Republicans that they needed to figure out a way how to get rid of President Johnson once and for all. And let us pause our presentation here at this moment with Congress ready to enact its version of Reconstruction. I hope you'll join me for the second half of this video to find out what happens. Spoiler alert, it won't end well. For now, thank you for watching, and I will see you on the other side of the screen.